With this lecture, we start A&P 2, the material for the first exam. The endocrine system is a collection of glands or organs that are going to produce and regulate hormones. Remember, when we talk about the endocrine system, it's one of the two systems that control everything that occurs in our body. So it overlaps with the nervous and the exocrine system. And the responsibilities include metabolism, growth, and sexual development.
I mentioned hormones in the previous slide, and so let's define it. First, the word comes from the Greek for to stimulate. So a hormone is a chemical. It's secreted by an endocrine gland into the blood. And remember that we're talking, whenever we say endocrine, endo, into. So it's into the blood, or it can go into an organ that's exhibiting an endocrine function. So it's got to go into something. It doesn't go on to things. If we're talking about neurohormone, this is a hormone that is actually secreted by a neuron, and it goes into the blood rather than into the synaptic cleft. So, for example, dopamine. Dopamine is going to be found in our blood. It doesn't create the reaction that you would expect from the nervous system by going into the synaptic cleft and having a synapses. It actually works in the blood. And another type of regulatory molecule would be a pheromone, and that's from the Greek, and it means to carry. So it is a communicator. It is a messenger. And this allows for outside of the body sensing. So I give the example of a dog urinating. So it's not a dog urinating because the dog feels the need to urinate. It is the dog urinating on every single tree. Or before my old girl, my dog Ellie, passed away in November, every time my younger dog Maisie would go outside to pee, Ellie felt it was necessary to go pee on top of where Maisie peed. Well, you clearly knew who the alpha was and who the beta was, right? So it is to communicate a message. Years ago in Dallas, there was an event where this group of people wanted to use pheromones to help you pick your next love. It was like an in-person speed dating, Match.com situation. And what you had to do was bring a t-shirt or another item of clothing that you had worn, and it was not washed, and you put it into a Ziploc bag, and people would go around smelling different bags in order to figure out which person they wanted to date. Sweat for humans, some sweat, is considered a pheromone, right? We have different types of sweat, as we talked about with skin, but it's considered a pheromone. All right. All right, so while we're talking about endocrine regulation, it's also great to think about another type of regulatory molecule that is called paracrine. And again, this is from the Greek, and it means mirror. So these are also regulatory molecules, but they're not endocrine. They are not transmitted by blood. An example of this is histamine. So paracrine regulation allows for signaling between cells so that there can be mass coordination. So prostaglandins are the most diverse group of paracrine regulators. So prostaglandins help with labor and ovulation. They help with the inhibition of gastric secretions. They help with constriction and dilation of blood vessels in the lungs. They allow your platelets to clot, right? To allow clotting. Um, they allow for renal blood flow, vasodilation, allowing for urine excretion, and they allow for inflammation, pain, and fever. So histamines will come to an area and that allows for inflammation to occur. So I just want you to think about when you're having an allergy attack, you have possibly, if it's a respiratory allergy attack, your eyes may get puffy, your face may swell, and then all of a sudden you have your nose is running and you're just completely stuffed up. Well, what do you take for that? You take an antihistamine, right? And so that antihistamine stops that allergic reaction. All right. So prostaglandins, and we have already talked about inflammation, pain, and fever. One way to inhibit the synthesis is by taking ibuprofen. So ibuprofen, inhibits inflammation and pain, or yes, they inhibit inflammation and pain. And what ibuprofen does is stops an enzyme that is in the cascade that is necessary to produce prostaglandins. So ibuprofen takes away inflammation. And actually, it just does not allow for it to continue. All right, so here is just a great image that shows you how we can have paracrine and endocrine reactions working together. All right, so let's look at um, what's happening with this neuron. It's producing a substance that is not going, this is a neurohormone, that is not going to a synaptic cleft, it's going directly to the cell. Remember, neurohormones. Here we have an endocrine gland that has the hormone that's carried by the blood, and it's also going directly to the cells. And then we have paracrine regulation, where we have cells that are next to the cells that are the target cells that are producing whatever the substance is that's needed, and it's also going to the cell. And just a question, what type of cells are these? And I hope that you can answer. I'm going to pause here for just a minute. Well, you should be able to tell me that that's a smooth muscle cell. All right, so you're seeing neurohormones and paracrine regulators, and you're seeing endocrine hormones all working in this situation where we have smooth muscle that needs to be directed. All right, so when we think about these hormones in regard to endocrine glands, they belong in 4 different categories. So just by looking at the names of them, you should be able to develop some form of description. Polypeptide. If it's a peptide, we have amino acids that are engaged. Poly tells you many. So short chains of amino acids, less than 100, right? Examples are insulin and antidiuretic hormones, right? Antidiuretic hormone. We'll talk a little more about that a bit later. Glycoproteins, again, just by the name, glyco indicates a carbohydrate, protein clearly is a protein. So this is longer than 100 amino acids, and it has a carbohydrate attached. So follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are examples of these. Amines, just by the name, amino acids that are derived very specifically from tyrosine and tryptophan. So these are epinephrine, norepinephrine, and melatonin. These are examples of hormones that are amines, right? And then steroids. So let's roll back for just a minute. Let's think about steroids and where do they fit? You remember that these are large organic molecules or compounds, right? But they belong in the lipid group. They're very specific in that they are derived from cholesterol, right? Lipids derived from cholesterols. So we have testosterone, estrogen slash estradiol, progesterone, progestin. Whether it's secreted by the testes, ovaries, or placenta, these are all sex steroids. And then we have the corticosteroids. And we haven't talked very much um, about this, but I do think that I had mentioned to you in A&P1, whenever you see cortico, it means it belongs to the cortex, and that is the outer edge of an organ or a structure. So if there is a cortex, there must also be a medulla, which is the center area. So if you take a big navel orange that has a thick skin on it, you peel off the skin and you throw it away. But in this instance, I want you to think about the skin like it's the cortex and the inside of the orange like it's the medulla. So a corticosteroid is derived from the adrenal cortex. Your adrenal glands are pyramid-shaped glands. There's one that sits on top of each kidney. From these glands, you will get cortisol and aldosterone, and both of these regulate glucose and salt balance. Cortisol is called a stress hormone. So if you have increased cortisol secretion, that may indicate that you have undergone or are undergoing a large amount of stress. That's not the only reason why, but it is called a stress hormone. Let's look at two different types of hormones based on their action. The first one is a lipophilic hormone, right? These are hormones that actually enter cells. So they go to the cell, they bind to a receptor, they form a complex, they then bind to an area of DNA, they activate the gene that is within that area of DNA, and they regulate target cells, right? So let's look at this example here in this picture. All right, so we're looking at a steroid hormone that is going to produce eventually this cascade that occurs because of the action of the steroid hormone is going to produce a specific protein. All right, so we first have this steroid hormone that is attached to its protein carrier, and it is in your blood. It crosses out of the blood and it then enters through the phospholipid bilayer, a cell. Once that steroid hormone gets to the cell, it attaches to a specific receptor. And remember, these are also proteins. The steroid and the receptor enter the nucleus through a nuclear pore. They then this complex attaches to DNA in a very specific place. Now, y'all know once this happens, the DNA is going to unravel in that very specific area, and then transcription is going to take place. Here we have transcription that's take place. taking place. Here's your mRNA. It's going to go out into the cytoplasm. We have translation taking place. We're missing a few things, right? Like free amino acids and tRNAs, but you can see that this is a ribosome. And then eventually a protein is going to be made, right? And that is produced. Okay, that is a lipophilic hormone. It can actually enter a cell. Then we have lipophobic proteins, and they can't enter the cell. So they have to direct whatever they're going to do from the outside. So here is a great example. We have a liver cell, and epinephrine, the hormone, is going to act with this liver cell. Have action with this liver cell. So epinephrine is going to attach to this receptor protein. Here's epinephrine, it's attached to the receptor protein. When that happens, it kicks off this cascade of events. And when that happens, and you do not have to know all of this process, I assure you, you have a portion of that receptor protein that is going to have a GTP attached to it. It's going to interact with this enzyme, which is another protein, adenyl cyclase. And when that happens, ATP is used. You make cyclic AMP. It activates kinase A, which activates phosphorylase. What I would like for you to know is that it allows for glycogen to be converted to glucose. Okay? So very simply, it is the action of epinephrine on a liver cell that allows for glycogen to be converted to glucose. And remember, glycogen is a glucose storage molecule. Epinephrine never enters the cell. It does react with the receptor protein, and that kicks off this cascade of events. And remember, you don't need to know the inner parts of that cascade of events, but you do need to know that epinephrine allows for glycogen to be converted to glucose, and epinephrine never enters the cell. When we look at the major endocrine glands, I want you to think about this image of this gentleman right here. You have the pineal gland and the pituitary gland in the brain, thyroid gland, thymus, adrenals. Remember I said they sit on top of each kidney. You have your pancreas right here, ovaries in females, testes in males. So then we can look at them a little more closely by looking at those that are in your brain. Let's look at the pituitary, right? Very specifically. Here's your hypothalamus in your brain. Hanging from your hypothalamus by a stalk is your pituitary gland, and it is split in two. You have the posterior pituitary and you have the anterior pituitary. Your posterior pituitary is responsible for ADH and oxytocin, and your anterior pituitary is in charge of everything else, right? So the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary are quite different. The posterior pituitary stores and releases, right? Stores and releases because there was neural stimulation from the hypothalamus, right? Two hormones that we are looking very closely at are antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Let's look in detail at antidiuretic hormone. Let's make ADH simple. If a diuretic makes you pee more, an antidiuretic is going to make you pee less. That is an oversimplification. but I want you to remember it this way. Diuretics make you pee, antidiuretics make you, air quoting here, not pee. Actually means pee less. All right, so antidiuretic hormone is going to decrease the amount of water that is released by your urine. All right, so let's look at this action. We'll take, for example, that you are dehydrated. When you are dehydrated, you have less water in your blood. So that lowers both the blood volume because you've removed all of the, not all of the water, but much of the water from your blood, and it lowers the pressure. All right. Another thing that happens is that you have the osmotic concentration of blood increases. Remember, osmosis means the movement of water. So the solutes are going to be more highly concentrated because you don't have as much blood. This is going to kick off your osmoregulators in your brain. All right, so you have lower blood pressure and lower blood volume, and you have greater concentration of solutes in your blood. That's your osmotic concentration. When this happens, in regard to the osmotic concentration, it is going to trigger the osmoregulators, and ADH is going to be synthesized by your cells in your hypothalamus, right? It's going to be synthesized by your cells in your hypothalamus. That ADH is then going to be released from your posterior pituitary. Notice that your posterior pituitary does not make or synthesize the actual hormone. All it does is store and release it. Your hypothalamus actually makes it. That ADH is then going to travel to two places. It is going to go to your blood vessels, and that increases vasoconstriction. That is going to eventually increase your blood pressure. When that happens, this is a negative feedback loop because you have negation of the effector. All right, so that is going to have your blood pressure increase. All right, the second thing that's going to happen is you have reduced urine volume because you've retained the water. So it's being pulled out of your urine. That is also a negative feedback loop. All right, antidiuretic hormone. Diuretics make you pee, antidiuretics make you pee less because you're pulling back the water. So now let's look at the anterior pituitary gland. It actually produces or synthesizes the hormones it secretes. So there is a big difference between the anterior and the posterior pituitary gland. A few of the hormones, growth hormone, stimulates bones and muscles. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, it allows for your glucose to remain in homeostasis. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, allows for you to produce thyroxine. Luteinizing hormone, which allows for ovulation and testosterone production. Follicle stimulating hormone allows for follicle development and sperm development in males. Prolactin stimulates the production of milk, and melanocyte stimulating hormone allows for the synthesis and dispersion of the melanin pigment. Looking at the anterior pituitary gland's anatomy, you can see the short stalk that attaches the entire pituitary to the hypothalamus, right? So this is your hypothalamus, this is the stalk. Here's your anterior pituitary, here is your posterior pituitary. The hypothalamus is going to secrete hormones that are carried by these short blood vessels, and they go to the anterior pituitary, where they're either going to stimulate or inhibit whatever the anterior pituitary is going to do. All right, so looking at this in a diagram form, your hypothalamus is going to release hormones that are going to go to your anterior pituitary. Which is then going to release hormones, which are then going to go to the target glands, right? TRH is thyrotropin releasing hormone. CRH is corticotropin releasing hormone. And GnRH is gonadotropin releasing hormone. All right. So your hypothalamus releases these, or secretes these releasing hormones. The releasing hormones must go to the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is then going to produce what are called tropic hormones that are going to act on target glands, and then these target glands are going to produce hormones. Once those hormones are produced, then they're going to, because this is negative feedback, is then going to either inhibit the anterior pituitary or the hypothalamus. All right. Remember why we use negative feedback, because we're trying to maintain constant levels of the hormone. Positive feedback does not maintain that constancy. Remember, positive feedback is like a snowball. The more you have, the more you get. And that's not true with negative feedback, because remember, when you have a product, it negates the effector, right? Remember that. Looking at the thyroid and the parathyroid glands, one, you see that they are very closely engaged with each other. Your parathyroid glands are 4 very small glands. Each one of them is about the size of an English pea. There's 2 on each side of your thyroid. Your thyroid is just below your Adam's apple, and it is shaped like a shield, maybe a bit of an elongated shield. Thyroxine is produced by your thyroid gland, and it helps to set your metabolism. And so it stimulates cell respiration. And remember, cell respiration uses glucose to make ATP. If you don't have ATP, you cannot have these cascades of events that you need to have within your body to stay in homeostasis. That's what happens in an adult. But in a child, these thyroid hormones also allow for the promotion of growth, and they stimulate maturation of the central nervous system. So what I'd like for you to do is look up cretin, CRETIN, and look at its link to thyroxine. All right. Now, can you live without a thyroid? Absolutely. Because you take a drug that is either it either mimics thyroxine, or you take thyroxine, and you take a drug that allows for you to go through cellular respiration, right? So it's like having a thyroid that's producing thyroxine, except the thyroid's gone, and you're just ingesting the drug once a day. Your parathyroid glands, they are attached to the thyroid, as I said, and they produce PTH, which is parathyroid hormone. PTH is absolutely essential for survival. PTH regulates the homeostasis of calcium. So let's just stop here for just a minute. Where has calcium appeared in the lectures that we've had. Calcium has appeared in the nervous system. It allows for neurotransmitters to be released on the presynaptic side, on the postsynaptic side. If it's a muscle, you have to have calcium attached to troponin, which then allows for tropomyosin to roll off the active site so that myosin can reach up and grab onto actin so that you can have a muscle contraction. So that's just two huge examples of why calcium in homeostasis is necessary. PTH stimulates the osteoclast, remember that's the bone eater, to dissolve calcium and free it up so that it can be in your blood. Okay, so calcium homeostasis is hugely, hugely important. This is a graphic representation of what occurs when one produces thyroxine. Your hypothalamus produces the releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, which then travels to the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary then produces thyroid stimulating hormone. That thyroid stimulating hormone then travels to the thyroid gland, which stimulates the thyroid gland to produce thyroxine. Because this is a negative feedback loop, thyroxine then flows through your blood and reaches the anterior pituitary, which stops the production of TSH and also goes to your hypothalamus to stop the production of thyrotropin releasing hormone. Now, when looking at parathyroid hormones, let's just pause here for just a minute because there may be some of you out there that have had your thyroid removed and you're wondering, well, what happened to my parathyroid hormones? Well, 1, 2, 3, or 4 of them were resected from your thyroid and were transplanted to a different structure in your throat, right? It can be attached mostly anywhere. As long as you have one good working parathyroid gland, you're in good shape. So your parathyroids produce PTH, parathyroid hormone, which then travels to your through your blood to 3 different organs. When PTH reaches your bone, it triggers osteoclasts to dissolve calcium phosphate and it releases the calcium. When it travels to your kidney, it allows for the reabsorption of calcium. That means you don't pee it out, and the excretion of the phosphates. When it goes to your digestive system, it allows for the increased absorption from your intestine, from whatever is in your intestine. And when that happens, it is then in your blood, which increases your blood calcium levels. And when that happens, there's a negative feedback loop that negates the low blood calcium. And so it stops or slows the production of parathyroid hormone. Your adrenal glands are found above each kidney. And so this is where we're going to talk about ADH eventually. So there are the pyramid-shaped structures sitting on top of each kidney. The cortex, remember I said, is this outer area, right? It's like an orange rind. We want to keep that. This is the medulla. But this is the cortex. And anything that is a hormone that is released from the cortex is known as a corticosteroid. Remember, cortisol maintains your glucose homeostasis, and aldosterone stimulates the kidneys to reabsorb sodium and secrete potassium in the urine. Right, so aldosterone is super important in maintaining your sodium and your potassium homeostasis, and um, cortisol is important in maintaining your glucose homeostasis. The medulla actually gets the information from the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, and it secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine in response, right? So your adrenal glands allow for epinephrine and norepinephrine to be released, as well as aldosterone and cortisol. Now let's talk about another endocrine organ known as your pancreas, right? It is adjacent to your stomach, and it is connected to your small intestine, to the duodenum, and it's connected by the pancreatic duct. And when we get to digestion, we'll talk quite a bit more about your pancreas. Your pancreas is not very big, but it has some very big jobs. One of them is the secretion of bicarbonate ions, which is a buffer, and enzymes into the small intestine. Again, we'll get into more of that when we get to the digestive system. But 1 to 2% of your pancreas is responsible for either lowering your blood glucose or raising your blood glucose, right? Those are antagonistic actions. All right, so let's think about where you are between meals. Your blood glucose level is low because you've not eaten. When that happens, your pancreas recognizes this. It's especially in the islets of Langerhans, and it allows for the secretion of insulin. These are from your beta cells. Or the secretion of insulin is decreased and glucagon is increased, right? So glucagon is then going to react with your liver, and it allows for glucose to be produced from glycogen, all right? And that is going to be secreted in your blood, and therefore you will no longer have low glucose levels in your blood. But if you look at what happens immediately after you've eaten, your blood glucose levels are high or they are increased. That is recognized by your pancreas, and it allows for the secretion of insulin to be increased and glucagon to be decreased. And when this happens, it moves glucose from your blood into your cells. All right? That is also a negative feedback loop because you have decreased blood glucose levels, right? So you don't need to have insulin secretion. We'll talk more about ovaries and testes when we get to your reproductive system. It produces androgens, testosterone, estrogen, um, and it allows for you to also have your secondary sexual characteristics. Another endocrine gland is your pineal gland. Some people call it the third eye or the seat of the soul. This allows people to have intuition at times, and it secretes melatonin, and it therefore regulates your biological clock.
Yeah, I would agree. Unless I took a poop or something. No. There's something's